In the spring of 1942, young women across America started receiving a letter that made absolutely no sense. It wasn't a typical war bond campaign. It wasn't a call to work in a factory or join the Red Cross. This letter, sent by both the United States Army and Navy to college campuses from coast to coast, asked two questions that seemed completely random. Do you like crossword puzzles? And are you engaged to be married? That's it. Two questions. No explanation. No job description. Just a vague mention of important war work in Washington and an assurance that their contributions would be vital to the Allied cause. Imagine opening that letter as a 21-year-old math major in 1942. Your country is at war. Your brother might be training for combat. Your father is following war news on the radio every single night. And now the government wants to know if you enjoy word puzzles and whether you're planning a wedding. What on earth could crossword puzzles possibly have to do with winning a war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan? For thousands of college-educated women, that mystery proved irresistible. These weren't typical times, and these weren't typical women. In 1942, only about 4% of American women attended college at all. The young women receiving these recruitment letters represented an elite group. They'd studied mathematics, foreign languages, music theory, chemistry, and liberal arts at a time when society expected most women to marry young and focus on homemaking. But the war had changed everything. Suddenly, the nation needed every capable mind it could find. And someone in military intelligence had realized something radical. Women who could solve complex crossword puzzles might also be able to crack enemy codes. The recruitment strategy was deliberately mysterious. The military couldn't exactly advertise wanted female cryptanalysts to break Japanese naval codes in the campus newspaper. The work was so secret that even revealing it existed could compromise national security. So they asked about crossword puzzles. A seemingly innocent question that actually served as a surprisingly accurate screening mechanism for the kind of analytical, pattern recognition thinking that cryptanalysis required. The question about marriage wasn't arbitrary either. The military needed women who could relocate immediately to Washington, D.C., live in barracks or crowded boarding houses, work 12-hour shifts, and devote themselves completely to their mission. They needed women without the competing obligations of an engagement or impending wedding. This wasn't about discrimination. It was about the harsh practicality of wartime logistics. The work would be demanding, the hours relentless, and the secrecy absolute. Put yourself in their position for a moment. What the letter didn't mention, what it couldn't mention, was the penalty for revealing anything about the work. If a woman accepted this mysterious job offer, she would be required to take an oath of secrecy so binding that violating it would be considered treason, punishable by prosecution and imprisonment. She would spend the next several years unable to tell her parents, her siblings, or her closest friends what she did all day. If anyone asked, she would have to lie and say she sharpened pencils or filed papers. And yet, thousands answered the call. Fran Perlmutter, a Boston University linguistics student, received her letter just after graduation in 1944. She had no idea what the work actually involved, but the mysterious nature of the recruitment intrigued her. And Cara Christie, a mathematics whiz from Russell Sage College, responded to a similar recruitment pitch. Virginia Dare Adderholt said yes. Dot Braden said yes. Frances Steen said yes. Dorothy Ramale said yes. By the time the war ended in August 1945, more than 10,000 American women would serve as cryptographers and cryptanalysts, working in absolute secrecy to break German and Japanese codes. They would constitute roughly 75% of the Allied cryptanalysis workforce. Not just in supporting roles, but as the actual codebreakers solving the mathematical and linguistic puzzles that turned encrypted enemy communications into actionable intelligence. These women would crack the Japanese naval code called JN-25, providing the intelligence that allowed the United States to shoot down the plane carrying Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. They would operate massive electromechanical machines called bombs that broke the German Enigma cipher, producing intelligence that protected Allied convoys from U-boat attacks in the Atlantic. They would process tens of thousands of encrypted enemy messages every single month, tracking ship movements, revealing battle plans, and giving American military commanders a precious advantage. They could read the enemy's mail. Their work, historians now estimate, shortened World War II by approximately 2 years and saved countless American lives. Yet for more than 50 years, almost nobody knew they existed. They went home after VJ Day carrying a secret so profound that even their husbands and children would remain unaware of what they had actually done during the war. They would attend reunions with college friends who had no idea their classmate had once tracked German U-boats across the Atlantic. They would become grandmothers who, when asked by curious grandchildren what grandma did in World War II, would smile and repeat the old cover story, "Oh, I just did some clerical work in Washington." Think about what that means. It wasn't until 1997, when the United States government finally began declassifying World War II intelligence operations, that these women could even legally talk about what they had done. By then, many were in their 80s and 90s. Some had already passed away without ever receiving recognition for helping win the most important war of the 20th century. This is their story. The forgotten story of America's Code Girls, the women who answered 2 simple questions and ended up changing the course of history. And it all started with a mysterious letter asking if they liked crossword puzzles. The recruitment letter that arrived at Smith College in early 1942 caused quite a stir among the seniors. It wasn't delivered through the normal campus mail system. These mysterious typed invitations showed up in the personal mailboxes of very specific students. Not everyone got one. Only certain young women found that strange letter waiting for them. The college administrators knew exactly who should receive these letters: women who excelled in mathematics, foreign languages, music theory, and other subjects that required pattern recognition and analytical thinking. The military had done its homework. They'd contacted college administrators and professors across the country, asking them to identify their brightest students, women who could handle complex intellectual work and wouldn't crack under pressure. At Smith, more than half of the seniors who received letters immediately called the vocational office to schedule interviews. The interview process itself was remarkably brief. 2 questions, just like the letter promised. Do you like puzzles? And are you engaged to be married? If you answered yes to the first and no to the second, congratulations. You'd just been recruited into one of the most secret military operations in American history. But here's what made the recruitment brilliant. The military wasn't just looking for women who enjoyed crossword puzzles as a casual hobby. They were screening for a very specific type of cognitive ability. People who genuinely love solving puzzles possess something cryptanalysis desperately needs. They can see patterns where others see only chaos. They have the patience to work through thousands of possibilities without giving up. They can hold multiple variables in their heads simultaneously while testing different hypotheses. In short, crossword puzzle enthusiasts think exactly like codebreakers. Consider how the British discovered this connection. In January 1942, the Daily Telegraph newspaper in London ran a crossword puzzle competition, challenging readers to solve a particularly difficult puzzle in under 12 minutes. What the competitors didn't know was that British intelligence officers were watching from the audience. The people who solved the puzzle fastest were quietly approached after the contest and asked if they'd be interested in important war work. Many of them ended up at Bletchley Park, Britain's code-breaking headquarters, where they helped crack the German Enigma cipher. American military intelligence adopted a similar strategy, but on a much larger scale. They needed thousands of codebreakers, not just dozens. So they went straight to the colleges, targeting women's institutions like Smith, Wellesley, Bryn Mawr, Goucher, and Seven Sister schools across the Northeast. They also recruited from state universities, small liberal arts colleges, and anywhere else they could find educated women with sharp analytical minds. The women who said yes faced a whirlwind transition from campus life to classified government work. At Smith College, selected seniors formed small groups of 10 to 12 students and began attending evening classes in the science building. The course was initially extracurricular. It didn't appear on transcripts and offered no academic credit. The title listed in the course catalog was deliberately vague: Naval Communications. Keeping the real purpose secret was absolutely paramount. What these women didn't know yet was that they were learning the fundamentals of cryptanalysis: how to recognize patterns in seemingly random letter sequences, how to perform frequency analysis on encrypted text, how to build code books by testing hypotheses against intercepted messages. The instructors couldn't be too explicit about the ultimate purpose, because even the training itself was classified. After graduation in the spring and summer of 1942, the women who'd successfully completed this secret training course received train tickets to Washington, D.C. Most had never been to the nation's capital. Most had never lived away from home except during college. Now they were boarding trains, traveling hundreds of miles, to start jobs they still didn't fully understand. When they arrived at Union Station in Washington, military cars picked them up. Some were driven 6 miles west to Arlington Hall Station, a former girls' junior college that the Army had seized and converted into a cryptanalysis center. Others went to a facility on Nebraska Avenue in Northwest Washington, where the Navy ran its own code-breaking operation. Both locations were now surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by military police, and filled with people hunched over desks covered in encrypted enemy messages. On their very first day, before they learned anything else about their new jobs, every single woman had to sign an oath of secrecy. The terms were stark and terrifying. Everything they were about to see, learn, and do was classified at the highest levels of national security. If they revealed anything, and I mean anything, about their work to anyone who wasn't cleared for that specific information, they would be prosecuted for treason. Liza Mundy, the historian who finally documented the Code Girls' story in her 2017 book, discovered that some women were actually told the penalty for violating their secrecy oath could be death by firing squad. Whether that was official policy or just an intimidation tactic used by overzealous security officers remains unclear, but the message was received loud and clear: you do not talk about this work, ever. The women were also given cover stories to use with family and friends. They were instructed to tell people they worked as secretaries or performed clerical duties, filing papers, typing correspondence, general office work. And because they were women in 1942, when society assumed women only did support roles anyway, almost everyone believed the cover story without question. It was a brilliant piece of misdirection. Who would ever suspect that thousands of young women filing into government buildings every day were actually breaking the most sophisticated enemy codes in history? The security protocols extended beyond just the secrecy oath. Every woman underwent a thorough background investigation before being granted clearance to work on classified cryptanalysis. Investigators interviewed family members, neighbors, former teachers, and anyone else who could speak to the woman's character and loyalty. The process took weeks, sometimes months, which created backlogs of recruited women waiting in Washington for their clearances to come through before they could actually start working. Interestingly, the very first group of American women recruited for cryptanalysis work didn't come through the college recruitment program at all. In May 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor, several members of the American Women's Volunteer Services approached Rear Admiral Noyes with an intriguing proposal. They argued that wives of naval officers could make significant contributions to cryptanalysis, a field the Navy considered short on qualified personnel. Admiral Noyes approved the experiment. 25 wives of naval officers, ranging from wives of lieutenants to wives of rear admirals, enrolled in a correspondence course in basic cryptanalysis. They studied at home, then met weekly for instructor-led review sessions. The group jokingly called themselves SWANs, Special Women's Auxiliary Naval Service. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, 21 of these women had already completed the cryptanalysis course. They immediately volunteered for active duty, and many were given civil service positions working on actual Japanese and German intercepts. The SWANs proved that women could absolutely handle cryptanalysis work. They'd just never been given the opportunity before. But 21 women, no matter how capable, couldn't handle the tsunami of intercepted enemy communications flooding into Washington after America entered the war. The military needed thousands more. Hence the recruitment letters. Hence the crossword puzzle question. Hence the women streaming into Washington from college campuses across America throughout 1942, 1943, and 1944. What none of these women knew yet, what they couldn't possibly know, was just how crucial their work would become to winning the war. When Dot Braden stepped off the train at Union Station on October 11, 1943, Washington felt overwhelming. The platform was packed with servicemen in uniform, families saying tearful goodbyes, and the constant announcements echoing through the cavernous terminal. This wasn't the sleepy college town she'd left behind in Lynchburg, Virginia. This was the nerve center of America's entire war effort, and it showed. Dot had exactly enough money in her pocket to pay for a cab ride to Arlington Hall. That's how uncertain everything was for these newly recruited code girls. The Army had sent her a train ticket, told her where to report, but hadn't arranged housing or even explained what her first day would look like. She was supposed to figure it out as she went. The cab driver navigated through the heart of Washington, past the Capitol building, the White House, monuments she'd only seen in textbooks. Then the scenery changed as they crossed into Arlington, heading toward what had been, just 18 months earlier, a private girls' junior college surrounded by gardens and riding rings. Now it was something else entirely. Barbed wire fences surrounded the entire campus perimeter. Armed guards stood at the entrance gates, checking identification and waving vehicles through. The elegant tea houses and manicured gardens were gone, replaced by hastily constructed temporary buildings that looked more like warehouses than academic facilities. This was Arlington Hall Station, the Army's Signal Intelligence Service headquarters, home to what would eventually become more than 10,000 codebreakers, the majority of them women. Picture yourself in Dot's shoes at that moment. She paid the cab driver, probably tipping with the last of her cash, and walked through those gates having no idea where she would sleep that night. The Army, it turned out, expected the code girls to find their own accommodations in the surrounding neighborhoods. They would receive housing stipends and lists of approved boarding houses, but the actual arranging? That was on them. Welcome to wartime Washington, where nothing was easy and everything moved at crisis speed. After Dot signed the terrifying secrecy papers, the ones that threatened treason charges for any disclosure of her work, she expected the Army to show her to some kind of dormitory or barracks. Instead, They handed her a list of local boarding houses and essentially said, "Good luck." She ended up renting a room in a hastily constructed dormitory near Arlington Cemetery, sharing space with dozens of other women who were all in the same bewildering situation. The following morning, Dot reported back to Arlington Hall for her actual first day of work. This is when things got real. She was taken to a classroom filled with other newly recruited women, all looking equally nervous and confused. An instructor walked in, closed the door, and began explaining what cryptanalysis actually meant. For most of these women, this was the first time they'd heard the word. The instructor showed them examples of encrypted Japanese messages, rows and rows of numbers that looked like complete gibberish. Then he showed them what those messages said once decrypted. Information about ship movements, supply routes, battle plans. The instructor's message was clear. You are looking at the enemy's secrets, and your job is to reveal them faster than they can change their codes. For women assigned to work on Japanese communications, the challenge was even more intense. Many had never studied Japanese language or even seen Japanese characters before. For Ann Perlmutter, the Boston University linguistics graduate who arrived at Arlington Hall in 1944, experienced this firsthand. On her very first day, after signing the secrecy papers and receiving her security badge, Fran was taken to a small room where an instructor told her bluntly, "You must learn Japanese." Not, "It would be helpful if you learn some Japanese," or "We'll gradually introduce you to the language." No, "You must learn Japanese, starting right now." Fran sat in that room studying Japanese characters, grammar, and vocabulary until midnight. When she left the building exhausted and returned to her room, she assumed she'd get a break the next day. Wrong. 14 hours later, she was back in that same room, still studying Japanese. The intensity was relentless because the work was urgent. Every day that American cryptanalysts couldn't read Japanese messages was a day that enemy ships moved undetected, that convoys sailed into ambushes, that intelligence advantages slipped away. Try to grasp the pressure these women faced. The Japanese language training focused on practical application rather than academic mastery. The Code Girls didn't need to read Japanese poetry or discuss philosophy. They needed to recognize military terminology, geographic names, ship types, and organizational structures. The messages they would be decrypting were written in Japanese, then encrypted into numeric codes and transmitted as dots and dashes representing syllables, punctuation, and emphasis. Decoding required understanding both the encryption system and the underlying Japanese language simultaneously. The training was compressed into a matter of weeks. There was no time for semester-long courses or gentle learning curves. The instructors pushed these women through intensive crash courses in cryptanalysis, code systems, frequency analysis, and whatever language skills they would need for their specific assignments. Some women were assigned to German codes and learned to recognize German military vocabulary. Others worked on Italian communications. The majority, particularly at Arlington Hall, focused on Japanese codes because that's where the Army's most urgent intelligence needs lay. Beyond the language and cryptanalysis training, the women received instruction in operational security and the critical importance of compartmentalization. They learned that they should never discuss their work with other code girls unless they were specifically assigned to the same project. Even then, conversations should be limited to the bare minimum necessary to accomplish the task. This wasn't paranoia. It was sound intelligence practice. If an enemy agent somehow managed to infiltrate Arlington Hall or Nebraska Avenue, compartmentalization ensured that no single person could compromise the entire operation. The women also learned their cover stories inside and out. If someone asked what they did at Arlington Hall, the approved response was clerical work. Typing, filing, administrative support. The beauty of this cover story was that it played into existing gender stereotypes. In 1943, society expected women in government jobs to be secretaries and typists, not cryptanalysts breaking sophisticated enemy codes. The cover story worked because people's prejudices made them believe it without question. Even with family members, maintaining the cover story was essential. Fran Perlmutter's parents knew the truth about her cryptanalysis work because the background investigators had interviewed them during her security clearance process. But when neighbors or friends asked why Fran had left Boston, her parents claimed ignorance. When the mailman wondered where she'd gone, they deflected. This culture of secrecy became so deeply ingrained that many code girls maintained it for the rest of their lives, even decades after the legal restrictions were lifted. After the initial training period, which typically lasted 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the woman's assignment, the real work began. The new code girls were escorted into the main working spaces at Arlington Hall, enormous rooms filled with rows and rows of desks, each occupied by a woman hunched over encrypted messages, code books, and worksheets. The scale was staggering. Hundreds of women working simultaneously, processing thousands of intercepted enemy communications every single day. Consider what must have gone through their minds at that moment. This was when the magnitude of what they had signed up for finally hit home. They weren't just helping with the war effort in some abstract, peripheral way. They were at the center of America's intelligence war, doing work that directly determined whether ships were sunk or saved, whether battles were won or lost, whether American servicemen lived or died. And now it was their turn to contribute. Arlington Hall Junior College for Women was never designed to become a military intelligence fortress. When it opened in 1927, the campus sprawled across 100 acres of manicured Virginia countryside, featuring elegant colonial architecture, landscaped gardens, wooded walking paths, a swimming pool, and even riding rings for the young women who boarded there. The 1941 college brochure painted an idyllic picture, interesting variety with its open lawns, landscaped gardens, and wooded sections. The main building, a yellow brick classic colonial structure, housed administrative offices, a well-stocked library, an auditorium, drawing rooms, parlors, and classrooms on the main floor. The upper floors contained dormitory rooms where students lived during their studies. Behind the main building stood a gymnasium and swimming pool, both of which remain intact today. Students at Arlington Hall took courses in music, art, drama, home economics, secretarial skills, and physical education. The kind of genteel education considered appropriate for young women of means in the 1920s and 1930s. It was, in every sense, a finishing school designed to prepare women for their expected roles as wives and mothers. But the school faced financial difficulties throughout the 1930s. By 1940, it had converted to a nonprofit institution in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. That reprieve lasted less than 2 years. On June 10, 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States Army invoked the War Powers Act and took possession of the entire campus. The students were sent home, the faculty dismissed, and what had been a quiet junior college for women became the headquarters of the Signal Intelligence Service, the Army's Cryptanalysis Division. Imagine the speed of that transformation. Arlington Hall officially became a military post on July 8, 1942, less than a month after the Army takeover. Over the next 3 years, massive construction efforts expanded the campus to accommodate the exploding cryptanalysis operation. The Army erected temporary wooden buildings across the grounds, structures that looked more like warehouses than the elegant colonial architecture of the original campus. Building 300, constructed in 1942 as enlisted men's barracks, was part of the initial construction campaign. Operations Building A, completed by September 1942, featured multiple floors of office space specifically designed for cryptanalysis work. The architectural drawings show heating systems, office layouts, and infrastructure built for around-the-clock operations. By 1943, another major structure called Building V had been completed. The expansion was relentless because the workload was overwhelming. Every day, radio listening posts scattered across the Pacific intercepted thousands of encrypted Japanese communications. Every single one of those intercepted messages needed to be processed, analyzed, and potentially decrypted. The original campus, designed for a few hundred students, now housed thousands of military personnel and civilian cryptanalysts working in rotating shifts. The scale of the operation was staggering. By the middle of the war, over 10,000 people worked at Arlington Hall. The majority were women. Specifically, more than 1,000 women assigned to the Women's Army Corps worked directly at the Arlington Hall complex, with thousands more civilian female cryptanalysts joining them. The organizational structure of Arlington Hall reflected the complexity of the cryptanalysis mission. The Signal Intelligence Service divided its work into distinct branches, each focusing on different aspects of Japanese communications. Branch B2, under the leadership of Solomon Kuhlbach, specialized in breaking Japanese Army codes, a task they didn't succeed at until April 1943, nearly 16 months after Pearl Harbor. Branch B3, led by Frank Rowlett, handled diplomatic codes and operated the bomb machines and other rapid analytical machinery used to attack complex cipher systems. Branch BI focused on translating the Japanese decrypts once the codes had been broken. Think about what this compartmentalization meant in practice. Most code girls working at Arlington Hall never understood the full scope of the operation. A woman working in Branch B2 on Japanese Army codes might walk past colleagues working on diplomatic intercepts without having any idea what those women were actually doing. Security protocols required strict compartmentalization. You only knew what you needed to know for your specific assignment. The physical layout reinforced this compartmentalization. Different buildings housed different sections. Within each building, different floors or rooms handled different code systems or message types. Access to certain areas required additional clearances beyond the basic security clearance needed to enter Arlington Hall in the first place. Arlington Hall operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The cryptanalysts worked in 3 rotating 8-hour shifts to ensure continuous coverage of incoming intercepted messages. The night shift was particularly grueling. Women working from midnight to 8 in the morning, hunched over encrypted messages under artificial lighting, fighting fatigue while maintaining the intense concentration that cryptanalysis demanded. The campus that had once featured riding rings and garden parties now bristled with security measures. Barbed wire fences surrounded the entire perimeter. Military police manned the entrance gates, checking identification badges and inspecting vehicles. No one entered or left Arlington Hall without authorization. Photography of any kind was strictly forbidden. Even discussing the location of the facility with outsiders was discouraged. Code girls were instructed to give only vague answers about where they worked. Despite the security measures and military atmosphere, something remarkable happened at Arlington Hall. A culture of intellectual camaraderie developed among the women working there. These weren't just factory workers performing repetitive tasks. They were mathematicians, linguists, music theorists, and liberal arts graduates applying their considerable intellectual abilities to some of the most challenging puzzles imaginable. And Kara Christie, who would eventually rise to become deputy director of the National Security Agency, found her intellectual home at Arlington Hall. She specialized in solving Japanese message addresses, the coded identifiers that revealed who was sending messages to whom and from what locations. This work required recognizing patterns across thousands of messages, building correlations between address codes and geographic locations or military units, and constantly updating her knowledge as the Japanese changed their address systems. Virginia Dare Adderholt worked on JH, an all-purpose Japanese code used for speeches, orders, and memoranda. Her specialty was tracking communications from Ambassador Naoto Sato, providing American intelligence with insight into Japanese diplomatic thinking during the crucial final months of the war. Braden and her team focused on Japanese naval codes, tracking fleet movements across the major oceans. The intelligence they produced directly contributed to sinking Japanese ships, though they wouldn't learn about the operational impact of their work until years after the war ended. Envision the daily reality these women faced. They didn't just work at Arlington Hall. Many of them lived nearby in hastily constructed dormitories or crowded boarding houses in Arlington neighborhoods. The housing situation was challenging throughout the war years. Washington was bursting at the seams with war workers, and finding affordable housing near Arlington Hall required persistence and often involved sharing cramped quarters with multiple roommates. Some women made the daily commute from boarding houses in downtown Washington, taking buses or streetcars to Arlington Hall each morning. Others found rooms in private homes where Arlington families rented out extra bedrooms to help with the housing shortage while earning extra income. The living conditions were far from luxurious, but these women weren't at Arlington Hall for comfort. They were there to win a war. By mid-1943, Arlington Hall had become the primary American center for breaking Japanese codes and ciphers. It wasn't the only cryptanalysis facility. The Navy operated its own operation at the Nebraska Avenue Complex in northwest Washington. But Arlington Hall's focus on Japanese Army and diplomatic communications made it absolutely critical to the Pacific War effort. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the history. A school that had once taught young women appropriate feminine skills like home economics and secretarial work had become the place where thousands of women proved they could master mathematics, cryptanalysis, and strategic intelligence analysis at the highest levels. The genteel finishing school was gone. In its place stood an intelligence fortress where women were winning an invisible war, one decoded message at a time. The alarm clock rang at 5 in the morning for women assigned to the early shift. 6 days a week, sometimes 7, up to 10 hours a day. That was the standard workload for code girls at Arlington Hall. The war didn't observe weekends, and neither could the cryptanalysts trying to read enemy communications in real time. After a quick breakfast in crowded boarding house kitchens or dormitory cafeterias, the women caught buses or streetcars heading toward Arlington Hall. Many lived at Arlington Farms, a massive temporary housing complex built in 1942 specifically for the thousands of government girls flooding into Washington. The Farms, as everyone called it, housed up to 7,800 women at its peak in dormitories named after American states. Idaho Hall, Montana Hall, Oregon Hall, and so forth. Arlington Farms wasn't luxurious, but it was functional. The complex featured a large recreation hall where Saturday night dances attracted servicemen from nearby military installations. A cafeteria seated up to 2,000 people at once, serving meals to waves of women coming and going on different work shifts. There was even a 30-dryer beauty shop, a post office, an infirmary, and professional classes in shorthand and typing for women hoping to advance their secretarial skills. Though the code girls knew their real skills had nothing to do with shorthand. The women at Arlington Farms formed their own tight-knit community. They published a newspaper called the Arling Gazette, the voice of Girl Town, documenting their lives, sharing gossip, announcing dance schedules, and creating a sense of normalcy in the midst of wartime Washington. The dormitories competed against each other in sports tournaments. Softball, volleyball, whatever they could organize in their limited free time. But consider the reality of their situation. The code girls who worked at Arlington Hall Station lived in two worlds simultaneously. During working hours, they were cryptanalysts handling some of the most sensitive intelligence in the entire war effort. After their shifts ended, they were supposed to become normal young women again. Attending dances, going to movies, shopping, dating, all while carrying secrets that could never be revealed. The psychological burden of that double life was immense. Modern psychological research has demonstrated that keeping secrets actually feels like carrying a physical weight. People who harbor significant secrets perceive hills as steeper, distances as farther, and physical tasks as more demanding. The mental effort required to constantly monitor what can and cannot be said is genuinely exhausting. For the code girls at Arlington Hall, that exhaustion was compounded by the fact that their secrets directly impacted life and death. They knew their work could mean the difference between an American convoy reaching port safely or being torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. They understood that a breakthrough in decrypting enemy codes could prevent an ambush or enable an American victory. This knowledge created a tremendous sense of responsibility that weighed on them constantly. Angie Nanny, who worked at Arlington Hall during and after the war, later described the social isolation that came with the secrecy requirements. "We were mostly single women," she recalled, adding that bachelorhood kind of came with the territory. "We were afraid to meet other people because at that time, we didn't know who we were going to meet. It might be a Soviet plant or an enemy agent. I was even afraid to join a church," Angie admitted. The women who worked at Arlington Hall became each other's primary social circle precisely because they were among the few people who could be trusted. They formed friendships that would last decades. Playing bridge together, bowling together, picnicking on weekends, shopping downtown. But even with each other, they couldn't discuss their actual work unless they were assigned to the same specific project. The compartmentalization was absolute. Inside the working areas at Arlington Hall, the atmosphere was intense but collegial. Hundreds of women sat at rows of desks, each hunched over encrypted messages, code books, frequency charts, and worksheets. The work required sustained concentration. Staring at columns of numbers or letters for hours, looking for patterns, testing hypotheses, building correlations between code groups and their probable meanings. Despite the demanding nature of cryptanalysis, moments of camaraderie broke through. When someone achieved a breakthrough, successfully recovering a new code group or identifying a pattern that unlocked a series of messages, excitement rippled through the room. The women would gather around, checking the work, confirming the discovery, celebrating the small victory before returning to their own assignments. Imagine working the graveyard shift in that environment. The three-shift system meant Arlington Hall never slept. Women working the night shift from midnight to 8 in the morning faced particular challenges. Under artificial lighting, fighting fatigue, they maintained the same standards of accuracy and concentration required during daylight hours. The intercepted messages kept arriving regardless of what time zone the cryptanalysts occupied, and enemy communications didn't pause for convenient American working hours. Break times offered brief respites from the intensity. Women would gather in common areas, drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes, a habit far more socially acceptable for women in the 1940s than it would become later, and talking about anything except their actual work. They discussed movies they'd seen, books they were reading, plans for the weekend, news from family back home. The unspoken rule was clear: work stayed at work. The cafeteria at Arlington Hall served meals around the clock to accommodate the rotating shifts. The food was institutional and unremarkable, but it was hot and plentiful. A significant advantage during wartime rationing when civilian restaurants struggled with shortages. Many code girls ate lunch at their desks, unwilling to lose time when messages were piling up. Dating and romance complicated the double life even further. How do you develop a relationship with someone when you can't talk about what occupies most of your waking hours? Some women dated servicemen stationed in the Washington area, which had its own challenges. Both parties were doing war work they couldn't discuss, creating relationships built partially on mutual silence about the most important aspects of their lives. The biweekly dances at Arlington Farms provided opportunities for socializing. Women dressed up in their best outfits, shift dresses, heels, carefully styled hair, and attended dances in the recreation hall where servicemen from nearby military installations would arrive by the busload. The dances offered a temporary escape from the pressure and secrecy of their real work. For a few hours, they could be normal young women enjoying music and company, not cryptanalysts carrying the weight of classified intelligence. Photographs from the era show women relaxing during intermission at these dances. Sitting in chairs, chatting, laughing, looking remarkably ordinary. They could have been any group of young women at any social event in 1943 America. Nothing in those photographs hinted that many of these women spent their days breaking enemy codes that would help win the war. The women formed deep, almost familial bonds with their coworkers. Gloria Forbes, Mildred Hayes, Carrie Berry, Joe Miller Deffenbaugh, Joan Malone Callahan, Jean Grabiol, and others who worked at Arlington Hall during the war developed an almost familial devotion to one another, according to later accounts. They had ferocious intellects, a powerful command of languages and math, a steely commitment to public service, and they relied on each other for emotional support in ways that outsiders could never fully provide. Some women, like Dot Braden, had taken government jobs because their families desperately needed the income during the Depression and wartime. The steady government salary, modest but reliable, meant they could send money home to parents or siblings struggling with their own wartime hardships. For these women, the work at Arlington Hall wasn't just about patriotic duty. It was also economic necessity wrapped in classified importance. The contrast between their public personas and private realities became so ingrained that many code girls found it difficult to maintain normal relationships with family members. When letters arrived from home asking about their work, they had to respond with bland descriptions of clerical duties. When they visited family on rare leaves, they had to deflect questions and maintain cover stories that made their lives sound far less interesting than they actually were. Reflect on what this meant for their sense of self. The secrecy even affected how they saw themselves. They were doing remarkable intellectual work, breaking sophisticated enemy codes, contributing directly to American military victories. But they couldn't take pride in their accomplishments publicly. They couldn't tell their parents, "I cracked the Japanese naval code today," or "my work helped sink an enemy ship." The validation and recognition that normally accompany significant achievements simply didn't exist for code girls during the war. This created a peculiar psychological state where their most important identity, as brilliant cryptanalysts conducting vital intelligence work, had to remain completely hidden, while their cover identity, as ordinary secretaries and file clerks, became the only version of themselves they could show the world. That dissonance between hidden truth and public fiction took a toll that many wouldn't fully process until decades later, long after the secrets were finally declassified. But during the war years, they simply did what had to be done. They maintained the double life. They carried the secrets. They showed up for their shifts, broke enemy codes, protected their intelligence sources, and lived with the constant awareness that their work mattered more than almost anyone outside Arlington Hall's barbed wire fence could possibly imagine. While the Army's Signal Intelligence Service at Arlington Hall focused primarily on Japanese codes, the United States Navy created its own cryptanalysis operation on Nebraska Avenue in Northwest Washington to tackle German communications. The facility that would become the nerve center of American efforts against German Enigma codes sat in an unassuming complex of buildings that few Washington residents even knew existed. On July 30th, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Public Law 689, establishing the Women's Reserve of the United States Naval Reserve. Better known by its catchy acronym, WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. This legislation opened the door for women to serve in naval operations beyond traditional nursing roles, and nowhere would their contributions prove more valuable than in the secret war of cryptanalysis. Judy Parsons was 23 years old when she graduated from the Carnegie Institute of Technology, now Carnegie Mellon University, in 1942. She had studied mathematics, exactly the kind of analytical background the Navy desperately needed for its expanding code-breaking operation. When Navy recruiters approached her about important war work in Washington, she didn't hesitate. What Judy didn't know when she boarded that train to Washington was that she would spend the next several years helping to break the most sophisticated cipher system ever devised, the German Enigma machine. And she certainly couldn't have predicted that more than 80 years later, at age 99, she would be one of the last living American women codebreakers from World War II. The Nebraska Avenue complex, where Judy reported for duty, looked nothing like a military installation from the outside. The Navy had taken over the former Mount Vernon Seminary, a private girls' school not unlike Arlington Hall's previous incarnation. But inside those repurposed academic buildings, some of the most critical intelligence work of the entire war was taking place. Here's something that might surprise you. The popular narrative suggests that Bletchley Park in England was the sole center for breaking German codes and ciphers. That's not actually true. After 1943, the majority of German code breaking was conducted right here in Washington, specifically at the Nebraska Avenue complex, by American waves like Judy Parsons. The waves at Nebraska Avenue operated in a highly structured environment that combined military discipline with intellectual intensity. Unlike the civilian cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall who maintained civilian status throughout the war, waves were formally enlisted in the Naval Reserve. They wore uniforms, held military ranks, and followed naval protocols. This military structure created a different organizational culture from Arlington Hall's more academic atmosphere. The work itself was equally demanding at both facilities. The German Enigma machine that the waves were tasked with defeating wasn't just difficult to crack. It was designed to be mathematically impossible to break through conventional means. The Enigma used a series of rotating wheels called rotors, each wired in complex patterns that created billions of possible encryption combinations. Every time a German operator typed a letter on the Enigma keyboard, electrical signals passed through the rotors in ways that transformed that letter into something completely different. What made Enigma particularly challenging was that the rotor settings changed daily. Every morning at midnight, German military units would reset their Enigma machines to new configurations specified in code books. This meant that even if Allied cryptanalysts figured out today's settings, that knowledge became worthless tomorrow. The codebreakers were running on a 24-hour clock. They had to break each day's settings before those settings changed again. Try to grasp the pressure of that deadline. The waves at Nebraska Avenue worked in 3 rotating shifts around the clock to maintain continuous coverage. Judy Parsons and her colleagues operated massive electromechanical machines called bonds that had been specifically designed to attack Enigma encryptions. These weren't computers in the modern sense. They were mechanical devices that used rotating drums and electrical contacts to simulate multiple Enigma machines simultaneously. Operating a bomb required both technical knowledge and analytical judgment. The women needed to understand the theoretical mathematics underlying the Enigma system while also mastering the practical operation of machinery that stood 7 feet tall and 10 feet wide. When a bomb found a potential solution, a rotor setting that might decrypt intercepted German messages, the operator had to recognize whether the machine had genuinely cracked the code or had simply generated random gibberish. Loose lips sink ships was more than just a wartime slogan for the waves working at Nebraska Avenue. It was a daily reality they lived with. Jean Trenier, another Navy wave who worked on breaking German Enigma codes, later recalled the absolute secrecy that governed their lives. They couldn't discuss their work with anyone outside their specific unit, couldn't tell families what they actually did, and lived with the knowledge that any security breach could cost Allied lives at sea. The intelligence produced by breaking Enigma codes proved absolutely vital to winning the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats operated in coordinated wolf packs, hunting Allied convoys carrying supplies from America to Britain. Decrypted Enigma messages revealed U-boat positions, patrol areas, and attack plans. This intelligence allowed Allied naval commanders to route convoys around known U-boat concentrations or position destroyer groups to hunt down submarines before they could attack. By late 1944 and early 1945, the waves at Nebraska Avenue were decrypting German naval communications so efficiently that Allied intelligence sometimes had more information about U-boat locations than American forces could act upon. The limiting factor was no longer intelligence. It was the availability of ships and aircraft to exploit that intelligence. Judy Parsons and her fellow waves worked under incredible pressure, knowing that every hour of delay in breaking Enigma settings could mean another convoy attacked, another merchant ship torpedoed, another group of sailors lost at sea. Yet they maintained that pressure day after day, shift after shift, for years. When the war ended in August 1945, the waves at Nebraska Avenue received the same order as the code girls at Arlington Hall: maintain absolute secrecy. Everything they had done remained classified. Judy Parsons went home and built a career as a research mathematician, all while carrying secrets she couldn't share for more than 50 years. The bomb machines that Judy Parsons and other waves operated at Nebraska Avenue didn't appear magically. Someone had to design them, manufacture them, and ensure they worked properly. And in one of the war's most remarkable untold stories, women played a crucial role not just in operating these cryptanalytic machines, but in actually building them. In a classified building located at the National Cash Register Company in Dayton, Ohio, an extraordinary manufacturing operation was taking place. The facility was producing 100 bomb machines specifically engineered to attack German naval Enigma ciphers. And the workforce assembling these sophisticated electromechanical devices included a significant number of women. This wasn't simple assembly line work. The bomb machines were complex pieces of equipment featuring rotating drums, electrical contacts, relays, and intricate wiring patterns that had to be absolutely precise for the machines to function. Women at the Dayton facility performed the detailed wiring and soldering work required to bring each bomb to life. Think about what that meant in 1943 America. Women were assembling cutting-edge cryptanalytic technology that most military officers didn't even know existed. They were working with electrical circuits, mechanical components, and technical specifications that would have been considered far beyond appropriate women's work just a few years earlier. Yet here they were, using precision tools and technical skills to build machines that would help win the war. The work required genuine technical expertise. Each bomb contained complex wiring that had to be executed perfectly. A single misplaced wire or poorly soldered connection could render the entire machine useless. The women doing this work needed steady hands, excellent attention to detail, and the ability to read and follow complex technical diagrams. The Navy waves who worked on bomb construction at Dayton brought diverse backgrounds to the task. Some had studied engineering or mathematics in college. Others had worked in technical fields before the war. Telephone operators who understood electrical systems, radio enthusiasts who knew electronics, teachers who had the precision and patience that detailed technical work demanded. Once the bombs were constructed in Dayton, they were shipped to the Nebraska Avenue complex in Washington, where additional waves would maintain and operate them. This created an interesting situation where women were involved in every stage of the bomb's life cycle: design consultation, construction, operation, and maintenance. The bombs themselves were impressive machines, standing roughly 7 feet tall and 10 feet wide. They used rotating drums to simulate the operation of multiple Enigma machines simultaneously. When an intercepted German message arrived at Nebraska Avenue, cryptanalysts would feed it into a bomb along with a crib, a guess about part of the message's content. The machine would then test millions of possible rotor settings, searching for one that would transform the encrypted message into something containing the guessed plaintext. Picture the scene inside Building 26 at National Cash Register. Operating these machines required understanding both their mechanical function and their cryptanalytic purpose. The waves needed to know how to load messages, set up cribs, recognize when a bomb had found a promising result, and troubleshoot mechanical problems when they occurred. They weren't just button pushers. They were technical operators of sophisticated equipment. The maintenance work was equally demanding. Bombs ran continuously, day and night, and that kind of constant operation created wear and tear. Electrical contacts needed cleaning, rotating drums required lubrication, and mechanical components occasionally broke and needed replacement. Women performed much of this maintenance work, gaining hands-on experience with electrical and mechanical systems that society assumed women couldn't handle. The involvement of women in building and maintaining the bomb machines represented yet another way that World War II expanded opportunities for female technical workers. While Rosie the Riveter became the iconic image of women in wartime manufacturing, the reality was far more diverse. Women weren't just riveting aircraft panels. They were wiring cryptanalytic machines, operating radar systems, repairing aircraft engines, and performing countless other technical tasks. After the war ended, the bomb machines were dismantled and the technology remained classified for decades. The women who had built, operated, and maintained them went back to civilian life, unable to list their most impressive technical accomplishments on any resume. Imagine being a skilled electrical technician who had wired 100 sophisticated cryptanalytic machines, but having to claim you'd only done clerical work during the war. This erasure of women's technical contributions wasn't unique to cryptanalysis. Throughout the post-war period, the narrative of women's wartime work focused primarily on traditional manufacturing roles while minimizing or ignoring their involvement in technical and scientific fields. The women who built bombs, operated radar, or conducted chemical analysis simply disappeared from the historical record. Only in recent decades, as World War II cryptanalysis documents have been declassified, has the full scope of women's technical contributions begun to emerge. Historians are now documenting not just the code girls who broke codes, but the women who built the machines that made modern cryptanalysis possible. Before Pearl Harbor, before the Pacific War even began, American cryptanalysts had already achieved one of the most remarkable intelligence breakthroughs in history. They had cracked Purple, the Japanese Foreign Office's most sophisticated diplomatic cipher machine, without ever having seen the actual device. Purple, which the Japanese called the System 97 typewriter for European characters, or Type B cipher machine, replaced an earlier diplomatic code system that American cryptographers had nicknamed Red. When decoded Japanese messages in late 1938 indicated that a new encryption system would be implemented in February 1939, the Army's Signal Intelligence Service knew they had a problem. Everything they had learned about Red was about to become useless. The Type B machine was an electromechanical device that used telephone stepping switches, the same technology used in early telephone exchanges, to encrypt diplomatic messages. This was cutting-edge cryptographic technology for 1939. The machine separated the 26 letters of the English alphabet into two groups, 6 letters and 20 letters. The 6-letter group used a relatively simple substitution system, while the 20-letter group underwent multiple layers of complex scrambling that changed with every keystroke. The women at Arlington Hall who worked on Purple faced a fascinating challenge. They were processing diplomatic traffic that revealed Japanese strategic thinking, negotiating positions, and assessments of international situations. Ambassador Hiroshi Oshima in Berlin sent particularly valuable reports to Tokyo. Long, detailed messages encrypted on Purple machines that discussed his personal conversations with Adolf Hitler and tours of German military installations. Consider the intelligence gold mine this represented. American cryptanalysts were reading confidential reports that the Japanese ambassador in Berlin was sending to Tokyo about his discussions with Hitler. General George Marshall later said that Ambassador Oshima was our main basis of information regarding Hitler's intentions in Europe. An enemy diplomat's communications, encrypted with what the Japanese believed was an unbreakable cipher, had become one of America's primary intelligence sources about Nazi Germany's strategic planning. Virginia Dare Adderholt specialized in breaking JH, an all-purpose Japanese code used for speeches, orders, and memoranda. Her work tracking Japanese diplomatic and military communications enabled American intelligence to monitor developments in real time. She specifically tracked all communications from Ambassador Naoto Sato, providing crucial insight into Japanese diplomatic thinking during the final months of the war. The intelligence derived from Purple decrypts was codenamed Magic. Magic intercepts gave American leadership extraordinary insight into Japanese diplomatic strategy throughout the war. However, and this is critically important, Purple was a diplomatic code, not a military code. The Japanese Foreign Office used Purple to communicate with embassies and consulates around the world, but the Japanese military services used completely different encryption systems. This distinction created a significant limitation in Purple's intelligence value. Diplomatic communications revealed political strategy, negotiating positions, and general military assessments, but they didn't contain specific operational plans for attacks or troop movements. The Japanese military deliberately withheld detailed operational information from the Foreign Office, which they considered insufficiently reliable for the most sensitive military secrets. This explains why Purple decrypts didn't warn of the impending attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack was a military operation planned and executed by the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the Navy never discussed those plans in Foreign Office communications. No detailed information about Pearl Harbor was even available to the Foreign Office. Reading Purple was like having access to Japan's diplomatic playbook while remaining mostly blind to its military playbook. Despite these limitations, Purple intelligence proved invaluable throughout the war. The women breaking Purple codes at Arlington Hall were reading messages that revealed Japanese assessments of America's intentions, Japan's diplomatic relationships with Germany and other Axis powers, and Japanese perceptions of their own strategic situation. Grasp the magnitude of this achievement. The technical accomplishment of breaking purple without ever seeing the actual machine remains astonishing. American cryptanalysts, led by William Friedman and his team at the Signal Intelligence Service, analyzed thousands of intercepted purple messages. They recognized that the six-letter group system was similar to Red's encryption method, which gave them an initial foothold. But the 20-letter group system was entirely new and far more complex. Through painstaking mathematical analysis, frequency studies, and brilliant intuitive leaps, they figured out how the stepping switch mechanism must work. In September 1940, they achieved a breakthrough that allowed them to construct an analog machine that duplicated purple's encryption behavior, even though they had no description of the actual Japanese device and had never seen one. The women working on purple at Arlington Hall operated these reconstructed purple machines, using them to decrypt intercepted Japanese diplomatic traffic. They would receive encrypted messages, set the machine to the correct daily key settings, and feed the encrypted text through the machine to produce plaintext Japanese. The messages were typically written in English or in Romanized Japanese, making translation more straightforward than the purely Japanese language military codes. The daily key settings for purple machines changed regularly, requiring cryptanalysts to solve new configurations. This was part of standard cryptographic security. Even if an enemy broke today's settings, those settings would be useless tomorrow. The code girls working on purple had to continuously solve new key arrangements while processing the steady flow of intercepted diplomatic traffic. One of the most famous purple decrypts came on December 6th and 7th, 1941. The Japanese Foreign Office sent a 14-part message to its embassy in Washington, breaking off diplomatic negotiations with the United States. American cryptographers decrypted and translated this message before the Japanese embassy in Washington could even finish typing it out. When the Japanese diplomats finally delivered the note to Secretary of State Cordell Hull on December 7th, Hull had to pretend he was reading it for the first time, even though he already knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor that was occurring at that very moment. The Japanese considered purple absolutely unbreakable. Most Japanese officials went to their graves refusing to believe the cipher had been broken through analytical means. They suspected betrayal, a spy who had revealed the system, because the idea that American cryptanalysts could break such a sophisticated machine-generated cipher seemed impossible. Yet that's exactly what happened, and women at Arlington Hall played crucial roles in exploiting that breakthrough throughout the war. While purple handled Japanese diplomatic communications, the Imperial Japanese Navy used an entirely different encryption system for its operational traffic. This system, which American cryptanalysts codenamed JN-25, would become the most important Japanese code broken during World War II. JN-25 was what cryptographers call a super-enciphered code. That's cryptography jargon for a system that applied two separate layers of encryption to every message. Understanding how it worked helps explain why breaking it was so difficult and why the women who cracked it were so brilliant. The first layer was the codebook. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained a massive codebook containing approximately 33,000 five-digit number groups. Each five-digit group represented a specific word, phrase, letter, or concept used in naval communications. For example, one five-digit group might mean aircraft carrier, another might mean attack at dawn, and another might represent Midway Island. Here's where it gets complex. After encoding a message using the codebook, Japanese communications officers didn't just transmit those five-digit groups. That would have been vulnerable to statistical analysis. Instead, they applied a second layer of encryption called an additive. Let me walk you through how this worked. The additive system functioned like this. Japanese cryptographers maintained separate additive books containing pages and pages of random five-digit numbers. To encrypt a message, they would take each 5-digit code group and add a 5-digit additive number to it using false addition, meaning they added each digit individually without carrying over. Let's say the code group for aircraft carrier Kaga was 01905. The additive might be 00989. Using false addition, 0 plus 0 is equal to 0, 1 plus 0 is equal to 1, 9 plus 9 is equal to 8, not 18, 0 plus 8 is equal to 8, 5 plus 9 is equal to 4, not 14. The resulting encrypted group would be 01884. That's what got transmitted. To decrypt JN25, you had to reverse both processes. First, subtract the additive to recover the original code group. Then look up that code group in the codebook to find out what it actually meant. Except the code girls at Arlington Hall didn't have the Japanese codebooks or the additive tables. They had to reconstruct both by analyzing thousands upon thousands of intercepted messages. The Japanese Navy implemented JN25 in June 1939. The version used at the start of the Pacific War in December 1941 was JN25B, which the Navy had introduced on December 1, 1940. JN25B contained approximately 45,000 5-digit code groups and used additive books with 50,000 5-digit additives each. Braden and her team at Arlington Hall worked on recovering JN25 code groups and additives. They tracked Japanese naval fleet movements across the major oceans. The Pacific, the Indian Ocean, even parts of the Atlantic where Japanese submarines operated. The intelligence they produced directly contributed to American successes in locating and sinking Japanese warships. The process of breaking JN25 was painstaking. Cryptanalysts would collect hundreds or thousands of messages. They would look for repeated 5-digit groups, which suggested those groups represented common words or phrases. They would look for messages with similar structures, which might indicate standard message formats. Situation reports, movement orders, weather reports. Certain message types had predictable content. Weather reports, for instance, always contained similar vocabulary and followed standard formats. If cryptanalysts could identify a weather report among intercepted messages, they could make educated guesses about which code groups represented terms like wind speed, visibility, or barometric pressure. Each successful guess provided a foothold for recovering more of the codebook. The additive recovery was equally challenging. Cryptanalysts would look for messages sent to multiple recipients, which often used the same additive sequence. By comparing these messages and analyzing the patterns, they could sometimes strip away the additive layer and expose the underlying code groups. Consider what Frances Steen accomplished in April 1943. She worked on the intelligence that tracked Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's movements. The breakthrough that enabled Operation Vengeance, the mission that shot down Yamamoto's plane, came from decrypting JN25 messages that revealed his inspection tour schedule. The messages specified exact times, aircraft types, and locations. That level of specific detail only became available because cryptanalysts like Francis had recovered enough of the JN25 codebook and additive tables to read operational traffic in near real time. The Japanese periodically changed their codebooks and additive tables precisely to frustrate Allied cryptanalysis. When JN25B was replaced with JN25C, then JN25D, and so on through multiple versions during the war, the code girls had to start much of the recovery process over again. They had to identify which messages used the new system, collect enough intercepts to perform statistical analysis, and rebuild their recovered codebook from scratch. Think about the scale of that effort. Thousands of intercepted messages, tens of thousands of 5-digit groups to recover and verify, dozens of additive tables to reconstruct. And all of it had to be done quickly, Because military intelligence is time-sensitive. Information about a convoy's position is only useful if you decrypt it before the convoy reaches its destination. The women at Arlington Hall created what historians have called an assembly line approach to breaking JN 25. Different teams specialized in different aspects of the work. Some focused on frequency analysis and pattern recognition. Others worked on recovering specific sections of the codebook. Naval terminology, geographic names, ship designations. Still others specialized in additive recovery. And senior cryptanalysts like Kara Christie coordinated these efforts, identifying which recovered code groups were reliable and which needed additional verification. By mid-1943, American cryptanalysts were reading substantial portions of JN 25 traffic quickly enough to provide actionable intelligence to fleet commanders. By 1944 and 1945, they were reading Japanese naval communications with such proficiency that the limiting factor was no longer intelligence availability. It was having enough submarines and aircraft to exploit all the targeting information the code girls were providing. The intelligence from JN 25 decrypts helped win the Battle of Midway, enabled successful submarine warfare against Japanese shipping, supported island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific, and gave American commanders a decisive advantage throughout the naval war. And thousands of American servicemen who never knew they'd been saved by cryptanalysis owed their lives to women like Dot Braden and Frances Steen, who spent years reconstructing Japanese codebooks one 5-digit group at a time. The glamorous version of codebreaking, the one that appears in movies and novels, involves brilliant cryptanalysts staring at encrypted messages for a few dramatic minutes before suddenly announcing, "I've got it," and solving the entire code system. The reality at Arlington Hall and Nebraska Avenue was infinitely less dramatic and far more exhausting. Most days involved what Kara Christie described as solving puzzles, except these puzzles arrived by the thousands and carried life-or-death stakes. The work began with the most basic cryptanalytic technique, frequency analysis. This meant counting letters or numbers in intercepted messages and looking for patterns. In English, the letter E appears most frequently, followed by T, A, and O. In encrypted text using simple substitution, the most common character in this cipher text probably represents E in the plain text. That sounds straightforward until you realize that sophisticated codes like JN 25 deliberately obscured these frequency patterns through multiple layers of encryption. So the code girls counted, and counted, and counted. They maintained massive frequency charts showing how often each 5-digit code group appeared in intercepted Japanese messages. They tracked which groups tended to appear together, which groups appeared at the beginning of messages versus the middle, which groups showed up in weather reports versus operational orders. This painstaking statistical work formed the foundation of everything else. Classical cryptanalysis involves an interesting combination of analytical reasoning, application of mathematical tools, pattern finding, patience, determination, and luck, according to cryptography textbooks. Notice that patience and determination appear in that list alongside mathematical tools. The intellectual brilliance mattered, but so did the sheer stubborn refusal to give up after the 100th failed hypothesis. Let me walk you through what a typical workday actually looked like for a code girl at Arlington Hall working on Japanese naval codes. She would arrive at her desk to find a stack of intercepted messages waiting for her. These weren't neat, typewritten documents. They were radio intercepts, often partially garbled by atmospheric interference, transmission errors, or operator mistakes. The first task was simply transcribing the message accurately, making sure every 5-digit group was recorded correctly. Next came the frequency work. She would check each 5-digit group against the master frequency charts maintained by her unit. If a particular group appeared frequently in multiple messages, that suggested it represented a common word or phrase. If it appeared rarely, it might be a proper name or specialized technical term. She would look for cribs, sections of messages where the content could be guessed. Weather reports were particularly valuable because they followed predictable formats and used consistent vocabulary. If she could identify a weather report among the intercepted messages, she could make educated guesses about which code groups represented wind speed, barometric pressure, visibility, and other meteorological terms. Each successful crib recovery added to the growing reconstructed codebook. But here's the challenging part. She couldn't be certain her recovery was correct until it was verified by testing it against other messages. A code group that seemed to mean aircraft carrier based on one message might actually mean something completely different. Only by testing the hypothesis across dozens or hundreds of messages could she confirm the recovery. This verification process was mentally exhausting. It required maintaining intense concentration while cross-referencing multiple messages, checking statistical patterns, and evaluating whether proposed meanings produced coherent text. One wrong assumption could cascade into a series of errors that took hours or days to untangle. The additive recovery work was even more demanding. Remember that JN25 applied a layer of random 5-digit numbers to each code group. To recover these additives, cryptanalysts looked for messages sent to multiple recipients, which often used the same additive sequence. By comparing these messages and analyzing the mathematical relationships between them, they could sometimes strip away the additive layer. The mathematics involved wasn't particularly advanced, mostly arithmetic and basic statistics. And Kara Christie herself had degrees in English and history, not mathematics. But the application of those mathematical tools required an almost intuitive feel for patterns and relationships that's difficult to teach. Modern research on pattern recognition suggests that expert pattern finders develop something called intuitive pattern recognition, the ability to perceive meaningful patterns without consciously analyzing every detail. The best cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall had developed this skill through thousands of hours of practice. They could look at columns of 5-digit groups and sense when something looked wrong or when a particular arrangement suggested a breakthrough. But developing that intuition required grinding through the tedious preliminary work. Before you can develop expert pattern recognition, you have to analyze enough patterns consciously to train your brain's unconscious processing. That meant months or even years of frequency counts, statistical analysis, hypothesis testing, and verification work. Picture the scene in those working rooms. The women worked in large rooms filled with rows of desks. The atmosphere was quiet but intense. Hundreds of women simultaneously hunched over their worksheets, occasionally conferring quietly with colleagues, but mostly working in concentrated silence. The only sounds were pencils scratching on paper, the rustle of messages being shuffled, and the occasional murmured discussion when someone needed to verify a result with a supervisor. Breaks were short and infrequent. The intercepted messages kept arriving, and there was always more work than available cryptanalysts. The pressure was constant. Every hour of delay potentially meant missed intelligence, and missed intelligence could mean American casualties. Some days brought the excitement of breakthroughs. When a code girl successfully recovered a particularly important code group or identified a new pattern that unlocked a series of messages, word would spread through the room. Supervisors would verify the discovery. Other teams would apply it to their own messages, and for a moment the tedium would give way to genuine excitement. But here's the truth most people don't realize. Most days were just work. Count the frequencies. Test the hypothesis. Verify the result. Record the recovery. Move on to the next message. Hour after hour, shift after shift, day after day. This was the unglamorous reality of breaking enemy codes. It was an intellectual endurance test as much as a display of brilliance. The women who succeeded weren't just smart. They were persistent, detail-oriented, and capable of maintaining concentration through mind-numbing repetition. And Zeilinger was born on February 1st, 1921, in Bronxville, New York. She graduated from Russell Sage College in Troy, New York, in 1942 with degrees in English and history. Not exactly the typical background for someone who would become one of the 20th century's most accomplished cryptanalysts. But the Signal Intelligence Service wasn't just looking for mathematicians when they recruited at women's colleges in 1942. They wanted intelligent, analytical minds capable of solving complex puzzles, and fit that description perfectly. She arrived at Arlington Hall on June 8, 1942, joining the very first wave of code girls recruited for the wartime cryptanalysis effort. At 21 years old, she was about to embark on a 40-year career in intelligence that would eventually lead her to become the deputy director of the National Security Agency, the highest position ever held by a woman at NSA at that time. Her initial training was conducted by William Friedman himself, the legendary cryptanalyst who had broken the Japanese purple diplomatic code. Friedman taught Anne and her fellow recruits in a classroom at George Washington University, explaining the fundamentals of cryptography and cryptanalysis. They were teaching us the basics of how to encipher things and how to attack an unknown system, and recalled decades later in interviews for the Veterans History Project. You would count letters or numbers and try to find patterns. The early problems they gave us were quite simple, but they got progressively harder, and was assigned to work on Japanese Army codes at Arlington Hall. Specifically, she specialized in solving message addresses, the coded identifiers that revealed who was sending messages to whom and from what locations. This might sound like a specialized technical detail, but it was actually intelligence gold. Consider what address analysis revealed. Understanding Japanese message addresses allowed American intelligence to map the entire organizational structure of Japanese military forces. If a particular address code appeared in messages originating from New Guinea, and those messages were addressed to a specific code representing Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, that revealed command relationships. If that same address code suddenly started appearing in messages from a different location, it suggested that military unit had been redeployed, and became extraordinarily good at address analysis. She developed an almost intuitive understanding of how Japanese military communications were structured. She could look at a message address and make educated guesses about the sender's location, unit designation, and command relationships. This was where mathematical analysis met intuitive genius. The mathematics involved was relatively straightforward. Frequency counts, correlation analysis, hypothesis testing. But knowing which hypotheses to test, which patterns were meaningful and which were coincidental, which anomalies suggested breakthroughs and which were just noise, that required something beyond pure mathematics. Modern cognitive science recognizes this as a hallmark of expert pattern recognition. Expert cryptanalysts develop what researchers call perceptual expertise, the ability to perceive meaningful structures that novices simply cannot see. Chess grandmasters recognize board positions. Radiologists detect subtle abnormalities in X-rays. And cryptanalysts like Ankara Christie could spot patterns in encrypted messages that revealed hidden intelligence. Anne's work tracking Japanese troop movements through address analysis directly contributed to American military successes in the Pacific. When American submarines or aircraft received intelligence about Japanese ship locations, or when ground commanders knew which Japanese units were deployed where, that intelligence often came from address codes that Anne and her team had decrypted. But she couldn't tell anyone about it. Not during the war, not for decades afterward. She went home each day carrying the weight of secrets that directly impacted whether American servicemen lived or died, and she couldn't share that burden with anyone outside the barbed wire fence surrounding Arlington Hall. After the war ended, and initially left government service briefly, but she returned to join the Armed Forces Security Agency, one of NSA's predecessor organizations, as a cryptanalyst. She had discovered her calling. Think about the trajectory of what happened next. Over the next 40 years, and rose steadily through the intelligence ranks. She became the first woman at NSA to be promoted to the supergrade level, the highest civilian rank, equivalent to the modern senior executive service. In 1975, she became chief of a group which focused on Soviet cryptologic issues. This was during the Cold War, when Soviet communications intelligence was NSA's top priority. In April 1980, and was named NSA's sixth deputy director. She was the first woman to serve in this role. As deputy director, she had special responsibilities for recruitment, training, and personnel, passing on her decades of expertise to new generations of cryptanalysts. The Department of Defense awarded her the Distinguished Civilian Service Award in 1980, the highest honor given to civilian government employees. Her colleagues described her as an inspired leader who preferred to be remembered for her operational accomplishments rather than her gender, and formally retired from NSA in August 1982, but she remained active in the intelligence community for years afterward. President Bill Clinton appointed her to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board in 1993. She served as president of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers from 1989 to 1991. In 2003, the National Intelligence University gave her an honorary degree and established the Cara Christie Award, given annually to high-performing graduate students. The Naval Intelligence Professionals Organization created an award in her name in 2002. And lived most of her adult life in an 18th-century one-bedroom cottage in Georgetown. Her hobbies included birdwatching and collecting pewter. She was predeceased by her longtime partner, Gertrude Elizabeth Kirtland, who was also a cryptanalyst and author. And Cara Christie died on January 10, 2016, in Washington, D.C., at the age of 94. She had been suffering from dementia in her later years. Her career trajectory illustrates something profound about the code girls of World War II. Many of them didn't just contribute to winning the war. They built lifelong careers in intelligence that shaped American national security for decades, and mentored countless NSA cryptanalysts, served on panels that identified future agency leaders, and helped integrate computers and new technology into cryptanalysis during the digital revolution. But it all started in June 1942, when a 21-year-old woman with degrees in English and history walked through the gates of Arlington Hall and began learning how to break enemy codes. What and thousands of women like her proved was that cryptanalytic genius wasn't about having a mathematics PhD. It was about analytical thinking, pattern recognition, persistence, and the ability to combine mathematical tools with intuitive insight. The young woman who started counting letter frequencies in 1942 eventually became the deputy director of the National Security Agency. That journey, from code girl to intelligence leader, represents not just one remarkable career, but the opening of an entire field to women's contributions. On April 14, 1943, a routine JN 25 intercept arrived at Arlington Hall that was anything but routine. The message, once decrypted, revealed that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, would be conducting an inspection tour of Japanese air units in the Solomon Islands. But the intelligence was far more specific than just a general itinerary. The decrypted message included exact departure times, precise arrival times, aircraft types, and even the number of escort fighters. Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 6 a.m. on April 18th aboard a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, accompanied by a second Betty carrying his stuff. 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters would provide escort. The flight would take approximately 2 hours, arriving at Balliol Airfield near Bougainville at 8 a.m. Think about what the women at Arlington Hall had just accomplished. They had decrypted a message that provided American military leadership with an extraordinary opportunity and an agonizing decision. Yamamoto wasn't just any Japanese military commander. He was the strategic genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack that brought America into the war. He had orchestrated the Indian Ocean raid. He had commanded at the Battle of Midway. American military leaders, including Admiral Chester Nimitz and Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, wanted revenge. But killing Yamamoto based on this decrypted intelligence would inevitably alert the Japanese that their codes had been broken. If Japan responded by completely overhauling their cryptographic systems, the intelligence advantage that code girls like Frances Steen had worked so hard to achieve would vanish overnight. The decision had to be made at the highest levels. President Franklin D. Roosevelt personally approved the mission. Admiral Nimitz authorized it. The assassination of an enemy military commander was legal under the laws of war, and Yamamoto represented such a high-value target that the risk of compromising code-breaking capabilities was considered acceptable. The mission was codenamed Operation Vengeance. Major John Mitchell of the United States Army Air Force's 339th Fighter Squadron was given command. The challenge was formidable. Bougainville was more than 400 miles from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the nearest American airbase. Standard P-38 Lightning fighters didn't have sufficient range for the round-trip journey. Engineers fitted 18 P-38s with external drop tanks that extended their range to barely enough for the mission. The pilots would fly low over the ocean to avoid Japanese radar, maintaining radio silence throughout the journey. They would need to time their arrival with split-second precision to intercept Yamamoto's flight exactly when and where the decrypted intelligence predicted he would be. The mission launched on April 18, 1943. Exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, and coincidentally the 168th anniversary of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. 16 P-38s made the journey. 2 had aborted with mechanical problems. Picture Major Mitchell's navigation challenge. Flying just 50 feet above the ocean for over an hour, changing course multiple times to avoid Japanese observation posts on various islands, the P-38s arrived at the intercept point near Bougainville at 9:34 a.m., exactly when the decrypted message had indicated Yamamoto would be there. And there he was. 2 Betty bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters, flying at less than 5,000 feet, exactly as the intelligence had predicted. The Code Girl's decryption had been perfect. What followed was a brief, violent dogfight. For P-38s, led by Captain Thomas Landfair and Lieutenant Rex Barber, dove to attack the bombers while the remaining 12 climbed to engage the Zero escorts. First Lieutenant Rex Barber engaged the lead bomber, which turned out to be transport T-1-323, the aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto. Barber's 50 caliber machine guns raked the Betty from tail to cockpit. The bomber's left engine began streaming smoke. The aircraft nosed down and crashed into the jungle below. A Japanese search and rescue party found Yamamoto's body the next day. According to Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Hamasuna, who led the recovery team, Yamamoto had been thrown from the wreckage, but remained upright in his seat under a tree, his white-gloved hand grasping the hilt of his katana sword. A post-mortem examination revealed 2 50 caliber bullet wounds. one to his left shoulder and another to his jaw that had exited above his right eye. The head wound had killed him instantly. The Japanese Navy initially concealed the violent details of Yamamoto's death from the public. The medical report was altered on orders from above, according to later accounts. Japan couldn't admit that their greatest naval commander had been ambushed and shot down because that would require acknowledging that their communications had been compromised. In fact, most Japanese officials went to their graves refusing to believe JN 25 had been broken through cryptanalysis. They suspected espionage, a spy who had revealed Yamamoto's schedule, because the alternative seemed impossible. How could American cryptanalysts break a super-enciphered code system that Japan considered unbreakable? But that's exactly what had happened. And Francis Steen, who worked on the JN 25 decrypts that revealed Yamamoto's schedule, had contributed to one of the most successful targeted assassinations in military history. The impact on Japanese morale was significant. Yamamoto was Japan's most respected naval commander, with a reputation for strategic brilliance that no other officer could match. His death removed irreplaceable leadership at a critical moment in the Pacific War. Consider what this meant for the Code Girls. For them at Arlington Hall, Operation Vengeance represented validation of something they had lived with every single day. The knowledge that their work directly impacted whether Americans lived or died. The tedious hours counting frequency distributions, the exhausting nights testing hypotheses about code group meanings, the relentless process of reconstructing Japanese codebooks one 5-digit group at a time. All of it had led to this moment. A Japanese admiral who had killed thousands of Americans at Pearl Harbor was now dead because women in their 20s had figured out how to read his mail. While Operation Vengeance captured attention as a dramatic single-target assassination, the daily intelligence produced by Code Girls at both Arlington Hall and Nebraska Avenue contributed to thousands of smaller victories that cumulatively shaped the entire course of the war. In the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic was essentially a battle of intelligence. German U-boats operating in coordinated wolf packs hunted Allied convoys carrying critical supplies from America to Britain. If Germany could sever that supply line, Britain might be forced to surrender regardless of what happened on other fronts. The mathematics of convoy warfare were brutal. A U-boat that stumbled across a convoy by chance might sink one or two merchant ships before the escorts drove it away. But if German naval intelligence could predict convoy routes and concentrate multiple U-boats in ambush positions, the results could be catastrophic. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, had studied these dynamics extensively and built his entire strategy around combining wolfpack tactics with convoy intelligence. The waves working at Nebraska Avenue on German Enigma decrypts were providing the Allied side of this intelligence war. Every decrypted German message revealing U-boat positions or patrol areas gave convoy planners the ability to route ships around known concentrations of submarines. But here's where the intelligence had to be used carefully. If convoys too obviously avoided every U-boat position, German commanders would realize their communications were being read and change their cipher systems. So the intelligence had to be disguised. Convoys would be rerouted, but the official reason would be weather or sighting reports from patrol aircraft. Sometimes convoys would sail near U-boat positions, but with heavy escort forces that had been positioned based on decrypted intelligence, even though officially they were just routine escort assignments. This elaborate deception worked. German naval intelligence spent enormous effort trying to determine whether Enigma had been compromised. They analyzed their own communications patterns, investigated suspected spies, and studied the timing of Allied convoy diversions. But without definitive proof, like a direct quotation from a German message appearing in Allied communications, they couldn't justify the massive disruption of changing their entire cipher system. So Enigma continued to be readable, and waves like Judy Parsons continued operating the bomb machines that decrypted German naval traffic. The intelligence advantage showed up in the statistics. From June to August 1943, carrier escort groups sank 15 U-boats and damaged 9 others. Over half of these directly resulting from prior knowledge of U-boat locations gained through Enigma decryption. Allied forces targeted milk cow submarines, larger U-boats used to refuel and reprovision other submarines at sea. By sinking these supply submarines, the Allies impacted entire wolf packs simultaneously, cutting down their operational efficiency. The effectiveness of Enigma intelligence became so pronounced that by mid-1943, German U-boat losses had reached unsustainable levels. Donitz was forced to withdraw U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes in May 1943, marking a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. While many factors contributed to this victory, including improved radar, air coverage, and escort tactics, the intelligence derived from Enigma decrypts was absolutely critical. In the Pacific, the intelligence from JN-25 decrypts produced similar operational advantages. American submarines operating against Japanese merchant shipping relied heavily on intelligence about convoy routes and schedules. The women at Arlington Hull tracking Japanese naval movements provided targeting information that American submarine commanders used to position their boats along enemy shipping lanes. Braden's work tracking Japanese fleet movements directly contributed to sinking Japanese warships. When an American submarine received intelligence about a Japanese cruiser's projected course and speed, that intelligence often originated from JN-25 decrypts that Dot and her colleagues had produced. Consider the scale of this intelligence operation. By late 1944 and early 1945, the cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall and Nebraska Avenue were producing so much actionable intelligence that operational commanders couldn't exploit all of it. The limiting factor was no longer intelligence availability. It was having enough submarines, aircraft, and surface ships to act on all the targeting information the Code Girls were providing. Think about what that means. The invisible war being fought by women hunched over encrypted messages at desks in Washington had become so successful that the actual shooting war couldn't keep pace with the intelligence being generated. Consider a specific example: Allied convoy on 166 in February 1943. German Bedienstintelligenz, their cryptanalysis service, had broken certain Allied naval codes and was providing Donitz with advance warning of convoy movements. On the night of February 18th, German Naval Command suddenly shifted multiple U-boat groups within 30 minutes, positioning them to intercept on 166. This success terrified Allied intelligence officers because it suggested their own codes might be compromised. If the Germans could read Allied convoy routing messages, the entire Atlantic convoy system was at risk. Intensive investigation eventually revealed that certain communication procedures, not the high-grade ciphers themselves, had been vulnerable to traffic analysis. But the episode demonstrated how this invisible intelligence war constantly operated in both directions. The women producing this intelligence rarely knew the operational impact of their work. Security compartmentalization meant they decrypted messages, recovered code groups, and submitted intelligence reports without learning what happened next. Only years after the war ended did many Code Girls discover that their work had contributed to specific victories, ships saved, or enemies defeated. And Kara Christie's address Code Analysis helped map Japanese military organizations and track unit movements. Virginia Dare Adderholt's work on JH codes provided insight into Japanese strategic thinking. Francis Steen's contribution to the Yamamoto intercept became part of intelligence history. And thousands of other code girls whose names never appeared in history books processed the daily flood of intercepted messages that gave Allied commanders their decisive intelligence advantage. Reflect on what this invisible war meant. The war they fought was just as critical as the visible one. Every convoy that reached port safely because it had been routed around U-boat concentrations represented lives saved. Every Japanese merchant ship sunk by an American submarine positioned based on decrypted intelligence represented supplies denied to enemy forces. Every German U-boat hunted down by escort groups guided to its location through Enigma decrypts represented one less threat to Allied shipping. By the time the war ended in 1945, historians estimate that Allied cryptanalysis shortened the conflict by approximately 2 years. That calculation represents millions of lives saved, both military and civilian. And women, primarily women, had produced the majority of that intelligence. Yet for decades, almost no one knew. There's a forgotten story within the forgotten story of America's code girls. While thousands of white women at Arlington Hall broke enemy codes and received decades of silence for their efforts, a smaller group of African American women faced an even more complete erasure from history. In early 1944, Arlington Hall established a segregated unit of Black cryptologists. These women worked in Commercial Code Unit 10, analyzing intercepted commercial communications from American companies and foreign banks to detect potential espionage, illegal trading with enemy nations, and violations of export controls. The work was critical to national security. American corporations with international operations sometimes violated trading restrictions, wittingly or unwittingly supplying materials that could benefit Axis powers. The African American women in a segregated unit monitored these communications, identified suspicious transactions, and provided intelligence that helped prevent strategic materials from reaching enemy hands. But consider the layers of invisibility they faced. Their existence was obscured by multiple barriers. First, there was the standard wartime classification that affected all cryptanalysts. The work itself was top secret. Second, there was racial segregation. The Black women worked in separate facilities from their white counterparts, ate in separate cafeterias, and used separate restrooms. Even people working at Arlington Hall were often unaware that this segregated Black unit existed. Arlington Hall was unusual for its time in that approximately 15% of its workforce was African American. This remarkable level of diversity for the 1940s may have resulted from direct intervention by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who throughout the war advocated for racial equity in military and government employment. Eleanor Roosevelt's commitment to civil rights was genuine and courageous. She spoke out against lynching, challenged discriminatory hiring practices, and used her position to open opportunities for African Americans even when it meant confronting powerful Southern Democrats and risking her own political standing. If she personally advocated for Black women to be recruited into cryptanalysis at Arlington Hall, as historian Liza Mundy suggests, it would be entirely consistent with her broader civil rights work. But equality in hiring didn't mean equality in treatment. The African American cryptanalysts worked in segregated conditions, faced discrimination from some white colleagues, and dealt with the reality that their contributions would likely remain even more invisible than those of their white counterparts. William Coffey, a Black man who had worked as a messenger, was appointed to supervise the segregated unit. He recruited many of the women, likely drawing from historically Black colleges and universities like Howard University. Coffey later received an award for his wartime leadership. But the names of the women he supervised, the women who did the actual cryptanalysis work, were almost completely lost to history. When Liza Mundy researched her book, Code Girls, in the 2010s, scouring National Security Agency records and numerous other archival sources, She could recover only two names of Arlington Hall's black women codebreakers, Annie Briggs and Ethel Just. Think about what that means. Those two names represent perhaps 100 or more African American women who worked at Arlington Hall during the war. The rest remain anonymous, their contributions unrecorded, their achievements unrecognized. The contrast with white code girls is stark. As records have been declassified over the past 25 years, historians have recovered hundreds of names of white women cryptanalysts, conducted interviews with survivors, and documented their specific contributions. But the African American women who worked in the segregated unit at Arlington Hall remain largely invisible. This erasure wasn't accidental. It resulted from the intersection of classification secrecy and racial discrimination. When white code girls left Arlington Hall after the war, they at least had each other. They could form social networks, attend reunions, and eventually share their stories once declassification allowed. But the African American women, segregated during their service, didn't have access to those same networks. They faced additional barriers to recognition even after the work was declassified. The NSA published The Invisible Cryptologists, African Americans, World War II to 1956 in 2001, 16 years before Eliza Mundy's Code Girls, documenting the challenges faced by Black cryptologists. But this important work received far less public attention than Mundy's later book. The title, Invisible Cryptologists, captures the double erasure these women experienced. They were invisible as women, and they were invisible as African Americans. Their story is a forgotten chapter within a forgotten chapter. Of the two names that survived in the historical record, both represent remarkable women who led teams despite facing the dual barriers of gender and race in 1940s America. Annie Briggs started her Arlington Hall career as a secretary, but she quickly demonstrated the analytical abilities that cryptanalysis demanded. She was promoted to join William Coffey in the messenger unit as his assistant in February 1944. As the segregated commercial code unit expanded, Annie became head of the production unit, which worked to identify codes, decode messages, and analyze commercial traffic for security violations. Leading the production unit meant Annie supervised other cryptanalysts, managed workflow, evaluated the reliability of code recoveries, and coordinated with other sections at Arlington Hall. She rose from secretary to unit leader through demonstrated competence, though she likely had to prove herself far more thoroughly than her white counterparts ever did. Ethel Just's path to Arlington Hall reflected a different trajectory. Genealogical research suggests she was Ethel Hayward Just, a language professor at Howard University who had earned a bachelor's degree from Ohio State University and a master's degree from Boston University. Ethel had been married to Ernest Everett Just, a pioneering Black biologist and one of the early African American graduates of Dartmouth College. The couple had 3 children before divorcing around 1939. Ethel lived in Washington, D.C., where she taught languages at Howard University. Her language expertise made her ideal for cryptanalysis work. At Arlington Hall, Ethel led a team of translators within the commercial code unit, processing decoded messages and rendering them into intelligence reports. The October 1956 edition of the Negro History Bulletin identified her as having worked as a translator in the War Department during the war, the closest public acknowledgement she received for decades. Imagine the challenges both Annie and Ethel faced. They were leaders in a unit that operated under extraordinary constraints. They dealt with the normal challenges of cryptanalysis: complex codes, massive volumes of traffic, time pressure, the intellectual demands of pattern recognition. But they also faced racial segregation, discrimination from some colleagues, and the knowledge that their achievements would likely receive even less recognition than those of white women doing similar work. After the war, Ethel just went on to become Dean of Women at South Carolina State University around 1950, continuing her work breaking barriers for Black women in education. Her granddaughter, Cheryl Everett Wormley, remembers her as an accomplished scholar and collegiate educator who broke barriers for Black women during the Jim Crow era. But Cheryl only learned about her grandmother's cryptanalysis work decades later, when historians began piecing together the story of Arlington Hall's segregated unit. Ethel, like all the Code Girls, had maintained her secrecy oath. She never told her family what she had actually done during the war. The other Black women who worked alongside Annie and Ethel remain nameless in the historical record. We don't know where they came from, what colleges they attended, what codes they broke, or what happened to them after the war. Their contributions to winning World War II have been almost completely erased. This erasure represents a profound historical injustice. These women faced discrimination while serving their country, then disappeared from history while their white counterparts eventually received recognition. Even now, with decades of declassification, their names remain unknown. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. World War II is over. In cities across America, spontaneous celebrations erupted. Times Square filled with celebrating crowds. The nation exhaled after 4 years of total war. At Arlington Hall and Nebraska Avenue, the celebrations were more muted. The women who had spent years breaking enemy codes knew they had contributed significantly to the victory, but they couldn't celebrate publicly. Within weeks, thousands received discharge papers or separation notices. They were given one final order: maintain absolute secrecy. Everything they had done remained classified. They were forbidden from discussing their work with anyone, including each other, once they left the facilities. Consider the weight of that final order. For many, this was the hardest command of all. They had accomplished something extraordinary, proven that women could perform complex intellectual work at the highest levels, provided intelligence that saved thousands of American lives, shortened the war by an estimated 2 years. Yet they would go home and tell no one. The secrecy created a historical void. When historians wrote accounts of World War II intelligence operations, they focused on stories they knew about. Bletchley Park, male cryptanalysts who had led major projects, technological achievements. The women who had constituted 75% of the Allied cryptanalysis workforce simply disappeared from the historical record. For more than 50 years, the story of America's Code Girls remained classified. The women honored their secrecy oaths even as decades passed. They raised families, built careers, became grandmothers without ever revealing what they had done during World War II. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the United States government began systematically declassifying World War II cryptanalysis records. Finally, after 50 years of enforced silence, the Code Girls could talk about what they had done. But think about the timing. By this time, many were in their 80s and 90s. Some had already passed away without ever receiving recognition. Fran Perlmutter was 95 when she finally felt free to discuss her cryptanalysis work openly. Judy Parsons, now 99, is one of the last living American women codebreakers from World War II. Historian Liza Mundy's 2017 book, Code Girls, The Untold Story of the American Women Codebreakers of World War II, brought their story to a wider audience. The National Security Agency published additional historical materials. Recognition, belated but genuine, finally began arriving. The legacy of America's Code Girls extends far beyond their cryptanalytic achievements. They proved, on a scale never before attempted, that women could perform complex intellectual work at the highest levels of difficulty and national importance. More than 10,000 women served as cryptographers and cryptanalysts, constituting the majority of the Allied cryptanalysis workforce. Some went on to build lifelong careers in intelligence. And Kara Christie became deputy director of the National Security Agency. Others returned to civilian life carrying secrets that shaped how they saw themselves for decades. Reflect on what this story reveals about history itself. The story of the Code Girls reminds us that history often overlooks the contributions of those who work in secrecy, particularly when those contributors are women. For more than 50 years, one of the most significant American achievements of World War II remained almost completely unknown. Now, finally, their story is being told. The women who answered two simple questions about matrimonial engagement and crossword puzzles helped change the course of World War II. They cracked codes that experts believed were unbreakable. They proved that gender was no barrier to intellectual achievement at the highest levels. And they did it all while maintaining a secrecy so complete that even their own families didn't know. The forgotten story of America's Code Girls is finally being remembered. It's a story of intelligence, dedication, and quiet heroism. It's a story of young women who took on a challenging mission and succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. And it's a reminder that the greatest contributions to history sometimes remain invisible for decades, waiting for the moment when they can finally be acknowledged and celebrated.